told you that some of the most brilliant military minds in history were UNT generals with fancy titles or kings with vast armies? They were individual warriors who changed the course of battles with strategies so insane, so unconventional, that even today's military experts study their tactics. Picture this. It's 1346, and you're facing an army 3 times your size. Your enemy has the best knights in Europe, the most advanced siege weapons, and enough gold to buy victory. But you have something they don't expect? A strategy so crazy, so against every rule of medieval warfare, that it will rewrite the textbook on how wars are won. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This is documented history. These are the stories of 10 warriors who proved that in medieval combat, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword or a crossbow. It was an unpredictable mind. From the English longbowman who single-handedly changed the nature of cavalry charges forever, to the Byzantine general who turned his own retreat into the enemy's nightmare. From the Mongol scout who used weather as a weapon of mass destruction, to the Crusader knight who made his enemies defeat themselves. These warriors didn't just fight battles. They redefined what it meant to be a soldier. Some were born peasants who rose to legendary status through pure tactical genius. Others were nobles who threw away everything their training taught them to embrace chaos. But all of them shared one thing. They were willing to risk everything on strategies that seemed absolutely insane, until they worked. Today, we're counting down the 10 most brilliant tactical minds of the medieval period. Warriors whose strategies were so unconventional, so seemingly suicidal, that their enemies never saw them coming. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why modern military academies still teach their methods. Why special forces units study their psychological warfare techniques, and why these medieval warriors remain the gold standard for thinking outside the box when everything is on the line. Are you ready to meet the masters of medieval mayhem? Warrior 10. William Marshall, the tournament king who revolutionized cavalry tactics. Imagine a knight who never lost a single combat in 70 years of military career. A man who transformed tournaments from noble entertainment into deadly laboratories of war tactics. Meet William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, the warrior whose strategies were so revolutionary they changed how all of Europe fought wars. Born around 1147, William Marshall wasn't the son of wealthy nobility. He was the youngest son of a miner family who had to prove himself with his sword. But this is where his genius began. While other knights saw tournaments as games, Marshall saw them as opportunities to develop new tactics. He created the revolutionary hammer and anvil formation. In this formation, one cavalry group acted as the hammer attacking frontally, while a second group moved in a circle as the anvil to surround the enemy. This strategy was so effective that Marshall and his team won over 500 consecutive tournaments. But tournaments were just practice. When the Third Crusade began, Marshall brought his tactics to real battlefields. At the Battle of Gisors in 1198, he faced French forces twice his number. The enemy used traditional formation, brutal but predictable frontal cavalry charges. Marshall did something that had never existed in any tactical manual. He ordered his troops to feign retreat, drawing the enemy into a trap. When the French cavalry pursued with the spirit of victory, Marshall reversed direction with a horn signal they had trained for months. Within seconds, what had been a retreat became a devastating counterattack. The French cavalry that was pursuing suddenly found themselves trapped between 2 wings of Marshall's forces. The result? A crushing victory that made William Marshall's name known throughout Europe. But what made Marshall truly revolutionary was how he integrated intelligence into cavalry tactics. He was one of the first commanders to use spies to study enemy habits before battle. Marshall knew that most knights had big egos and tended to fight individually seeking glory. So he created the false champion tactic, sending one of his best knights to challenge a duel. Then, when the enemy was lured out of formation, the entire unit would attack. This psychological strategy was so effective, it was used at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217. At age 70, Martial led his final cavalry charge against French rebels. Using a combination of tournament tactics and psychological warfare, he managed to defeat forces led by Prince Louis of France. This victory not only saved the English throne for the still-child King Henry III, but also proved that tactical innovation could defeat raw numbers and strength. William Marshall died in 1219 as the greatest knight that ever lived according to medieval chronicles. His legacy. The cavalry tactics he developed became the standard throughout Europe and were used until the era of firearms. He proved that in medieval warfare, a sharp mind was deadlier than a sharp sword. Warrior number 9. John Hawkwood, the mercenary who invented modern military deception. What happens when you take a common English archer and give him an army of the most ruthless mercenaries in 14th century Italy? You get Sir John Hawkwood, the man who turned military deception into an art form so sophisticated that Sun Tzu would have been impressed. Born around 1320 as the son of Etana, Hawkwood had no noble blood, no inherited wealth, and no formal military training. What he had was something far more dangerous. A mind that saw warfare as a chess game where the rules could be rigged. After fighting in the 100 Years' War, Hawkwood arrived in Italy around 1360 with nothing but his longbow and a reputation for surviving impossible odds. Within a decade, he commanded the White Company, the most feared mercenary band in Europe. But Hawkwood's genius wasn't in his fighting ability. It was in his understanding that the enemy's mind was the most important battlefield. At the Battle of Castagnaro in 1387, Hawkwood faced the Paduan army, led by Giovanni Ordelaffi, a commander with twice as many troops and superior heavy cavalry. Traditional tactics would have meant certain defeat, so Hawkwood did something that violated every principle of medieval warfare. He deliberately split his forces in full view of the enemy. Ordelaffi, seeing what appeared to be a tactical blunder, ordered an immediate charge to exploit the mistake. But Hawkwood had studied his opponent for months. He knew Ordelaffi was aggressive, impatient, and prone to attacking without proper reconnaissance. The split was a carefully orchestrated illusion. What looked like two separate, vulnerable units was actually a sophisticated pincer movement designed to funnel the enemy cavalry into a killing zone. As the Paduan heavy cavalry charged through the gap, Hawkwood's hidden crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions in the marshland. The cavalry found themselves trapped in boggy ground, unable to maneuver, while crossbow bolts rained down from 3 directions. But the masterstroke came next. Hawkwood had positioned his reserve forces behind a hill, completely invisible to the enemy, when Ordelaffi committed his infantry to support the trapped cavalry. These fresh troops appeared as if from nowhere, striking the Paduan rear. The psychological impact was devastating. The Paduan army, convinced they were fighting a much larger force, broke and fled. Hawkwood had achieved total victory with inferior numbers through pure tactical deception. This wasn't luck or battlefield improvisation. Hawkwood had spent weeks studying the terrain, the weather patterns, even the personality quirks of enemy commanders. He pioneered the use of false intelligence, deliberately feeding misinformation to enemy spies to manipulate their battle plans. His mercenary companies became the first military units to use systematic psychological warfare as a primary weapon. Hawkwood's innovations extended beyond individual battles. He created the first professional military intelligence network in medieval Europe, with agents in every major Italian city. This network allowed him to predict enemy movements, identify internal conflicts he could exploit, and even manipulate political situations to create favorable conditions for his campaigns. When Hawkwood died in 1394, he was one of the wealthiest men in Italy, having earned his fortune not through inheritance or trade, but through the systematic application of military genius. His funeral was attended by kings and princes who had once been his enemies. The Florentines, whom he had served for the last decade of his life, commissioned a massive fresco in the cathedral to honor him. Modern military academies still study Hawkwood's campaigns as masterclasses in asymmetric warfare and psychological operations. He proved that in an age of heavy armor and noble bloodlines, the most powerful weapon was an innovative mind willing to break every rule. Warrior 8. Bertrand du Guesclin, the ugly knight who mastered guerrilla warfare. They called him the ugliest man in France, and the Black Dog but Bertrand du Guesclin proved that in medieval warfare, beauty meant nothing when you could make your enemies disappear into thin air. Born around 1320 in Brittany, du Guesclin was everything a medieval knight wasn't supposed to be. Short, stocky, with a face that chroniclers described as frightening to behold, he was rejected by noble society and mocked by his peers. But this rejection became his greatest weapon. While other knights obsessed over chivalric codes and honorable combat, du Guesclin studied a different kind of warfare. He learned from Breton peasants how to move silently through forests, from smugglers how to use hidden paths, and from poachers how to strike without warning. By the time he was 30, du Guesclin had transformed these dishonest skills into the most effective military strategy of the 100 Years' War. His breakthrough came during the Breton War of Succession in the 1350s, facing English forces with superior numbers and equipment. Traditional French tactics had failed repeatedly. Knights charging in formation were being slaughtered by English longbowmen. Castle sieges were lasting years with no decisive results. Du Guesclin realized that trying to fight the English at their own game was suicide. So he invented a completely new game. Instead of meeting armies in open battle, he made the armies disappear. His strategy was revolutionary. Never fight where the enemy expects you, never stay where they can find you, and never let them know what you're really planning. At the Siege of Rennes in 1356, du Guesclin faced an English army led by Henry of Grosmont, one of the most experienced commanders of his era. The English had surrounded the city with a textbook siege, cutting off all supply lines and preparing for a long blockade. Du Guesclin was trapped inside with a garrison of only 400 men against 4,000 English troops. Any conventional commander would have surrendered or prepared for a heroic last stand. Du Guesclin did neither. Instead, he turned the siege into a nightmare for the besieged. Using secret tunnels that only local Bretons knew about, his men began appearing behind English lines at night. They would strike supply convoys, assassinate sentries, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. But the psychological warfare was even more devastating than the physical attacks. Du Guesclin's men would leave behind cryptic messages, move equipment to impossible locations, and create the impression that they were everywhere at once. English soldiers began reporting ghost sightings and supernatural attacks. Morale collapsed as the besiegers became convinced they were fighting an enemy that couldn't be killed. After 3 months, Henry of Grosmont lifted the siege. Not because he couldn't take the city, but because his own army was on the verge of mutiny. This victory established du Guesclin's reputation. But his masterpiece came later during his campaigns to drive the English out of France. Between 1370 and 1380, he recaptured over 100 English-held fortresses without fighting a single major battle. His method was always the same. Study the target for weeks, identify the weakest point, strike with overwhelming force at the perfect moment, then disappear before enemy reinforcements could respond. Du Guesclin pioneered what modern military theorists call asymmetric warfare. He understood that a smaller, more mobile force could defeat a larger, conventional army by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. His tactics included fake retreats that lured enemies into ambushes, false intelligence that sent enemy forces chasing shadows, and coordinated attacks on multiple targets that stretched enemy resources beyond their breaking point. But perhaps his most innovative strategy was psychological. Du Guesclin realized that fear was more powerful than any weapon. He deliberately cultivated his reputation as an almost supernatural figure who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish without a trace. English chroniclers began describing him as a demon or sorcerer, which only enhanced his effectiveness. When Du Guesclin died in 1380, he was Constable of France, the highest military position in the kingdom. King Charles V ordered that his heart be buried in the royal necropolis at St. Anna, usually reserved for royalty. His funeral was attended by the entire French nobility, the same people who had once mocked his appearance. Modern special forces units study Du Guesclin's campaigns as textbook examples of unconventional warfare. His tactics of mobility, surprise, and psychological operations became the foundation for guerrilla warfare that would be used for centuries. He proved that in medieval combat, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the strongest or the most noble. It was the one who refused to play by the rules. Warrior 7. Subutai, the Mongol general, who weaponized winter itself? What if I told you that one man figured out how to turn the deadliest season into his personal weapon of mass destruction? Meet Subutai, the Mongol general who didn't just conquer enemies. He made winter itself fight for him. Born around 1175 as the son of a blacksmith, Subutai had no royal blood, no inherited armies, and no formal military education. What he had was something far more dangerous: the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. While European knights were still figuring out how to fight in summer, Subutai was mastering the art of winter warfare on a scale that would be seen again until World War II. His genius wasn't just tactical, it was meteorological. Subutai studied weather patterns like a modern climatologist, tracking seasonal changes, predicting harsh winters, and timing his campaigns to coincide with the most brutal conditions nature could provide. But here's what made him truly terrifying. While winter weakened his enemies, it made his Mongol forces stronger. The breakthrough came during his campaign against the Empire in 1219. Most generals avoided winter campaigns because they were logistical nightmares. Armies couldn't forage for food, horses died from cold, and soldiers deserted rather than freeze to death. Subutai saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. He realized that if he could solve the logistics of winter warfare, he would have a 4-month window when his enemies would be completely defenseless. So he revolutionized military supply chains in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Subutai's forces traveled with massive herds of livestock that could survive in sub-zero temperatures. Each Mongol warrior had multiple horses trained to find grass under snow and dig through ice to reach water. They carried concentrated foods that provided maximum nutrition with minimum weight. But the real innovation was psychological preparation. While European armies saw winter as an enemy to be endured, Mongol forces were trained to see it as an ally to be embraced. They practiced fighting in blizzards, learned to use snow for camouflage, and developed tactics specifically designed for frozen terrain. The result was an army that became more effective as conditions became more brutal. Subutai's masterpiece came during the invasion of Russia in 1237. European military doctrine said that winter campaigns in Russia were impossible. The distances were too vast, the cold too severe, and the logistics too complex. Russian princes had built their entire defensive strategy around this assumption. They would retreat to fortified cities during winter, knowing that no army could maintain a siege in temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Subutai shattered this assumption with a campaign so audacious that it redefined what was militarily possible. Instead of avoiding winter, he launched his main offensive in December, when Russian forces were scattered in winter quarters and completely unprepared for combat. His 150,000-man army moved across frozen rivers like highways, using the ice as natural bridges that could support the weight of siege engines. What should have been impassable terrain became a superhighway for Mongol forces. But Subutai's true genius was in his understanding of winter psychology. He knew that defenders trapped in cities during winter sieges would face a terrible choice: stay inside and starve, or venture out into conditions that favored his mobile forces. At the siege of Moscow, Subutais forces surrounded the city in January 1238, when temperatures were at their most brutal. Russian defenders, expecting the Mongols to retreat when the cold became unbearable, instead watched in horror as the siege intensified. Mongol engineers used the frozen ground to their advantage, building siege ramps from packed snow and ice that were actually stronger than traditional earthworks. They diverted rivers to create ice walls that protected their siege engines from defensive fire. Most terrifyingly, they used the wind patterns of winter storms to carry flaming arrows and incendiary devices with devastating accuracy. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Russian chronicles describe defenders who surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't comprehend an enemy that seemed to grow stronger as winter grew harsher. Within 6 months, Subutai had conquered an area larger than all of Western Europe, capturing over 14 major cities in conditions that European military experts considered impossible for warfare. But Subutai's winter warfare innovations extended beyond Russia. During his campaigns in Hungary and Poland, he used frozen rivers to move armies at speeds that seemed supernatural to medieval observers. His forces would appear hundreds of miles from where they were last seen, striking targets that thought they were safe until spring. At the Battle of Mohi, in 1241, Subutai's army crossed the frozen Danube River at night, flanking Hungarian forces who had positioned themselves to defend river crossings that they assumed would be impassable in winter. The Hungarians woke up to find Mongol forces attacking from directions they thought were geographically impossible. When Subutai died in 1248, he had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon combined. His winter warfare tactics influenced military strategy for centuries, and modern Arctic warfare doctrine still incorporates principles he developed 800 years ago. He proved that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the biggest army or the best weapons. It was the one who could make nature itself fight on his side. Warrior 6. Saladin, the Sultan, who turned enemy psychology into a weapon. What happens when you combine the tactical brilliance of Alexander the Great with the psychological warfare mastery of Sun Tzu? You get Saladin, the Kurdish Sultan who didn't just defeat the Crusaders. He made them defeat themselves. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub around 1137, Saladin grew up in a world where military might was measured in heavy cavalry charges and castle sieges, but he understood something that would revolutionize medieval warfare. The most important battlefield was UNT, made of stone and steel. It was made of fear, doubt, and human psychology. While Crusader knights focused on perfecting their armor and sharpening their swords, Saladin was studying their minds. He spent years analyzing Crusader behavior, identifying their psychological weaknesses, and developing strategies that would turn their greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. His breakthrough insight was revolutionary. European knights were trained for individual glory, not coordinated warfare. Their entire military culture was built around personal honor, which made them predictably irrational in battle. Saladin realized he could manipulate this cultural programming like a master puppeteer. The genius of his approach became clear during the campaign leading to the Battle of Hattin in 1187. King Guy of Jerusalem had assembled the largest Crusader army in decades. Over 20,000 knights and infantry, the cream of European military power. Traditional military wisdom said this force was unbeatable in open battle. Saladin had roughly equal numbers, but his strategy wasn't to match strength with strength. Instead, he decided to make the Crusaders destroy themselves through their own psychological weaknesses. The campaign began with what appeared to be a simple siege of Tiberias, but this was psychological theater, not military necessity. Saladin knew that Tiberias was defended by Esquiva of Bears, the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most influential Crusader leaders. He calculated that attacking her would create an emotional crisis in the Crusader leadership that would override their tactical judgment. The psychological manipulation worked perfectly. When news reached the Crusader camp that Esquiva was under siege, the knights demanded immediate action. Raymond of Tripoli, despite being one of the most experienced military commanders, found himself caught between military logic and personal honor. He knew that marching across the desert in July to relieve Tiberius was tactically suicidal, but he couldn't publicly advocate abandoning his own wife without destroying his reputation and political position. Saladin had engineered a situation where the Crusader leadership would be forced to choose between smart tactics and social survival. Predictably, they chose social survival. The march to Hattin became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Saladin's forces shadowed the Crusader army, launching constant hit-and-run attacks that weren't designed to inflict casualties. They were designed to inflict stress. Every arrow shot, every skirmish, every night raid was calculated to increase Crusader anxiety and exhaust their mental reserves. But the real psychological weapon was thirst. Saladin had studied the route and knew exactly where the Crusaders would need water. His forces systematically poisoned or blocked every water source along the march. As the July heat intensified and water became scarce, the psychological pressure became unbearable. Knights began removing their heavy armor, not because of enemy action, but because of heat exhaustion. Horses collapsed from dehydration, leaving cavalry units stranded on foot. Most importantly, the rigid discipline that made Crusader armies effective began to break down as individual survival instincts overrode military training. By the time the Crusaders reached the Horns of Hattin, they were no longer a coordinated army. They were a collection of desperate, dehydrated, psychologically shattered individuals wearing the uniforms of soldiers. Saladin's final psychological masterstroke came during the battle itself. Instead of launching an immediate all-out assault, he positioned his forces to give the Crusaders a clear view of Lake Tiberias in the distance. The sight of water, so close yet unreachable, completed the psychological destruction that the march had begun. Crusader knights, trained from childhood to maintain formation and follow orders, began breaking ranks to charge desperately toward the lake. This wasn't military tactics. It was mass psychological breakdown. Saladin's forces simply had to position themselves between the Crusaders and the water, then watch as the enemy army disintegrated. The Battle of Hattin wasn't won through superior weapons or numbers. It was won through superior understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Within hours, the largest Crusader army ever assembled was completely destroyed. Qinghai was captured, along with most of the military leadership of the Crusader states, but Saladin's psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield. His treatment of prisoners was calculated to maximize political impact back in Europe. He executed Reynold of Chatillon personally, but spared Qinghai and most other nobles. This wasn't mercy. It was strategic communication. By showing that he could be both ruthlessly decisive and magnanimously merciful, Saladin created a psychological profile that would influence European perceptions for generations. The psychological impact of Hattin reverberated across the medieval world. European chronicles describe a crisis of confidence that went far beyond military defeat. The Crusader states had been built on the assumption of European military superiority. Saladin had shattered that assumption not through technological innovation, but through psychological mastery. When Saladin died in 1193, he had recaptured Jerusalem and reduced the Crusader presence in the Holy Land to a few coastal cities. But his greatest victory wasn't territorial. It was psychological. He had proven that in medieval warfare, understanding your enemy's mind was more powerful than understanding their military capabilities. Modern military psychologists still study Saladin's campaigns as masterclasses in psychological operations and strategic communication. He demonstrated that the most effective weapon against a technologically superior enemy isn't better technology. It's better psychology. Warrior 5. Edward the Black Prince, the master of tactical deception who redefined battlefield mobility. What if I told you that a 16-year-old prince figured out how to make an entire army disappear and reappear like ghosts on the battlefield? Meet Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, the English royal who did unjust win battles. He rewrote the rules of medieval warfare through pure tactical genius. Born in 1330, Edward was thrust into combat at an age when most nobles were still learning courtly manners. But this early exposure to warfare became his greatest advantage. While seasoned commanders were locked into traditional thinking, Edward's young mind was free to see possibilities that others couldn't imagine. His revolutionary approach to warfare was built on a simple but radical premise. Mobility beats armor, deception beats strength, and speed beats numbers. This philosophy would transform him into the most feared military commander of the 14th century. Edward's breakthrough came at the Battle of in 1346, when he was just 16 years old. His father, King Edward III, had positioned the English army in a defensive formation against a French force that outnumbered them 3-1. Traditional medieval tactics called for the English to hold their ground and hope their longbowmen could thin the French ranks before the inevitable cavalry charge. But the Black Prince saw an opportunity that no one else recognized. He realized that the French army's greatest strength, their heavy cavalry, could be turned into their greatest weakness through tactical manipulation. While the main English force held the center, Edward took a small mobile unit and began what appeared to be a flanking maneuver. But this wasn't a simple flanking attack. It was the first recorded use of what modern military theorists call dynamic battlefield repositioning. Edward's unit would appear on the French left flank, launch a brief but intense attack, then vanish before the French could respond effectively. Minutes later, they would materialize on the right flank, strike again, and disappear. The psychological effect was devastating. French commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Their heavy cavalry, designed for frontal charges against fixed positions, couldn't adapt to an opponent that refused to stay in one place. But Edward's true innovation was in his understanding of battlefield communication. He developed a system of horn signals and banner movements that allowed his mobile units to coordinate complex maneuvers in real time. This gave him the ability to concentrate force at the exact moment and location where it would have maximum impact, then dispersed before the enemy could The French army, despite its numerical superiority, found itself constantly reacting to Edward's initiatives rather than executing their own battle plan. By the end of the day, the French had suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in medieval military history. But was just the beginning. Edward's masterpiece came during the Poitiers campaign of Issy-en-Wouleu. Leading through French territory, Edward found himself trapped near Poitiers by a French army led by King John II. The French force was massive, over 50,000 men compared to Edward's 8,000. Any conventional commander would have sought terms for surrender. Edward instead engineered one of the most audacious tactical deceptions in military history. He began by sending envoys to negotiate, not because he wanted peace, but because he needed time to study the French deployment and identify their psychological weaknesses. During these negotiations, Edward's scouts were mapping every detail of the terrain and French positions. What they discovered was that King John II, eager to avenge the humiliation had positioned his army for a massive frontal assault that would crush the English through sheer weight of numbers. The French battle plan was predictable, which made it exploitable. Edward's response was to create what appeared to be a standard defensive position, but was actually an elaborate trap. He positioned his main force on a hill behind a hedge, creating the impression of a static defensive formation, but hidden behind the hill. Edward had positioned his most mobile units with orders that defied every principle of medieval warfare. When the French attack began, These hidden units didn't move to reinforce the main line. Instead, they began a wide circling movement that would take them completely around the battlefield. The French, focused on the frontal assault, never noticed this flanking force until it was too late. But Edward's tactical genius went beyond simple flanking maneuvers. He had studied the French command structure and identified a critical vulnerability. King John II insisted on leading from the front, which meant that capturing or isolating him would decapitate the entire French army. As the battle reached its climax, Edward's flanking force struck the French rear just as his main force launched a counterattack from the hill. The French army found itself caught in a perfect pincer movement, but the real masterstroke was yet to come. Edward had positioned a small elite unit with one specific mission: capture the French king, using the chaos of the battle as cover. This unit fought its way directly to King John's position. The psychological impact of seeing their king captured in the midst of what they thought was a winning battle shattered French morale completely. Within hours, the largest French army of the century had been destroyed by a force 1/6 its size. King John II was Edward's prisoner, along with most of the French nobility. The ransom demands would bankrupt France and establish England as the dominant military power in Western Europe. But Edward's innovations extended beyond individual battles. He pioneered the concept of strategic mobility, the ability to move large forces quickly across vast distances to strike where the enemy least expected. His weren't just raids. They were carefully planned campaigns, designed to force the enemy to react to English initiatives rather than pursuing their own strategic objectives. Edward's forces could appear hundreds of miles from where they were last reported, strike devastating blows against enemy infrastructure, and vanish before effective countermeasures could be organized. This strategic mobility gave England a psychological advantage that lasted for generations. French commanders never knew where Edward might strike next, which forced them to spread their forces thin, trying to defend everywhere simultaneously. When Edward died in 1376, he had never lost a major battle. His tactical innovations influenced military thinking for centuries, and many of his concepts weren't fully understood until the development of modern combined arms doctrine. He proved that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the biggest army or the strongest castle. It was the one who could think faster, move quicker, and strike where you least expect it. Warrior for Skanderbeg, the Albanian eagle who turned mountains into fortresses? What happens when you take a hostage prince? Give him the best military education in the Ottoman Empire, then watch him use that knowledge to become their greatest nightmare. Meet George Kastrioti, known as Skanderbeg, the Albanian lord who did unjust fight the Ottoman Empire. He turned an entire country into an impregnable fortress using nothing but mountains, cunning, and pure tactical genius. Born around 1405. Skanderbeg's story begins with what seemed like the end of Albanian independence. As a child, he was taken as a hostage to the Ottoman court, part of the Devshirme system that turned Christian boys into elite Muslim soldiers. For most captives, this meant the death of their original identity. For Skanderbeg, it became the foundation of the most brilliant military education in medieval Europe. The Ottomans unknowingly created their own destroyer. While training in Constantinople, Skanderbeg studied every aspect of Ottoman military doctrine, from siege warfare to cavalry tactics to administrative systems. He learned how the empire conquered territories, how they maintained control, and most importantly, how they thought about warfare. But Skanderbeg was also studying something the Ottomans never intended to teach: their weaknesses. He observed that Ottoman success depended on fighting conventional armies in open terrain, where their superior numbers and discipline could dominate. Their entire military machine was designed for conquest, not for fighting an enemy that refused to be conquered. In 1443, Skanderbeg made his move. Using forged documents, He convinced an Ottoman garrison to surrender the fortress of Kruyu to him, claiming he had been appointed as the new governor. Within hours, he had declared Albanian independence and begun the most audacious military campaign of the 15th century. But Skanderbeg's genius was not in the rebellion itself. It was in how he made Albania unconquerable. He realized that trying to fight the Ottomans with conventional tactics would be suicide. Albania had a tiny population compared to the Ottoman Empire, no significant allies, and limited resources. Any traditional military approach would result in quick defeat. So Skanderbeg invented something entirely new: fortress warfare on a national scale. His strategy was revolutionary. Turn the entire country into a single, massive fortification that would be impossible to conquer. The key was Albania's mountainous terrain, which Skanderbeg transformed from a geographical feature into a weapon of war. He began by studying every mountain pass, every hidden valley, every cave system in Albanian territory. His forces mapped routes that only locals knew, identified defensive positions that could be held by small numbers against large armies, and established supply caches in locations that would be impossible for invaders to find. But the real innovation was in how Skanderbeg organized Albanian society for total war. Instead of maintaining a traditional army that could be defeated in a single battle, he created a network of interconnected resistance cells. Every village became a fortress, every farmer became a soldier, and every mountain became a battlefield where Albanian forces held every advantage. The Ottoman response was predictable. They sent massive armies to crush this upstart rebellion. What they found was unlike anything in their military experience. Albanian forces would appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effectiveness, then vanish into terrain that Ottoman troops couldn't navigate. Skanderbeg's fighters knew every secret path, every hidden cave, every source of water in the mountains. They could move unseen, while Ottoman forces stumbled through unfamiliar territory, constantly vulnerable to ambush. But Skanderbeg's masterpiece was the Siege of Kruyu in 1450. Sultan Murad II himself led an army of over 100,000 men to crush Albanian resistance once and for all. The siege should have been a foregone conclusion. The largest army in the world against a mountain fortress defended by fewer than 8,000 men. Skanderbeg turned it into a masterclass in defensive warfare. His strategy was to make the siege more costly for the attackers than the defenders, while Ottoman forces struggled to maintain supply lines across hostile territory. Skanderbeg's defenders were supplied through secret mountain routes that the Ottomans never discovered. Ottoman soldiers, accustomed to quick victories, found themselves trapped in a grinding siege that lasted months, with no progress. But the psychological warfare was even more devastating than the physical defense. Skanderbeg's forces would launch night raids that seemed to come from impossible directions. Ottoman sentries would be found dead at their posts, with no sign of how the attackers had approached. Supply convoys would disappear without a trace, their guards vanishing as if swallowed by the mountains themselves. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Ottoman soldiers, the most disciplined and experienced in the world, began reporting supernatural attacks and ghostly enemies. Morale collapsed as the siege dragged on with mounting casualties and no visible progress. After 4 months, Sultan Murad II lifted the siege. Not because Kruyu couldn't be taken, but because the cost of taking it would have bankrupted the empire. This victory established Skanderbeg's reputation across Europe, but his strategic genius extended far beyond individual battles. He pioneered what modern military theorists call asymmetric defense, using geographical advantages and local knowledge to neutralize a superior enemy as technological and numerical advantages. Skanderbeg's Albania became a laboratory for guerrilla warfare tactics that would not be fully understood until the 20th century. His forces perfected hit-and-run attacks, intelligence networks, and supply line disruption on a scale that amazed contemporary observers. European chroniclers described Albanian fighters as appearing and disappearing like spirits, striking where least expected and vanishing before retaliation was possible. But perhaps Skanderbeg's greatest innovation was strategic patience. He understood that he didn't need to defeat the Ottoman Empire. He just needed to make conquering Albania more expensive than it was worth. Every Ottoman campaign into Albanian territory became a costly nightmare that drained resources and manpower without achieving decisive results. Over 25 years, Skanderbeg fought off 13 major Ottoman invasions, each larger and more determined than the last. His success inspired resistance movements across the Balkans and earned him the title Athleta Christi from Pope Calixtus III. When Skanderbeg died in 1468, Albania had maintained its independence for a quarter century against the most powerful empire in the world. The Ottomans finally conquered Albania only after his death. And even then, it took them another decade to fully pacify the territory. Modern military academies study Skanderbeg's campaigns as masterclasses in asymmetric warfare and defensive strategy. His tactics influenced resistance movements for centuries and demonstrated that a small, determined force with superior knowledge of local terrain could successfully resist a much larger conventional army. He proved that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the biggest army or the most advanced weapons. It was the one who could turn the very landscape into an ally. Warrior 3, Jan Zika, the one-eyed general who revolutionized medieval warfare with peasant weapons. What happens when you give a one-check general a bunch of farm wagons and tell him to fight the most powerful military force in medieval Europe? You get Jan Zika, the man who did UNC defeat knights in shining armor. He made them obsolete using nothing but peasant ingenuity and tactical genius that was 400 years ahead of its time. Born around 1360, Zika came from minor nobility with no significant wealth or political connections. What he had was something far more valuable, a mind that could see military possibilities, where others saw only limitations. While European warfare was dominated by heavy cavalry and expensive siege engines, Zika was studying the potential of common tools and ordinary people. His revolutionary insight would transform medieval combat forever. The catalyst came in 1419 with the outbreak of the Hussite Wars. The Holy Roman Empire, backed by the Catholic Church, declared a crusade against Bohemian religious reformers. The crusading armies represented the pinnacle of medieval military power. Heavily armored knights, professional soldiers, and siege equipment that had conquered territories across Europe. Against this overwhelming force stood the Hussites, mostly peasants, craftsmen, and minor nobles, with limited military training and almost no heavy equipment. Any conventional military analysis would have predicted their immediate annihilation. Zika saw opportunity where others saw hopelessness. He realized that the Crusaders' greatest strengths, their heavy armor, expensive horses, and rigid tactical formations, could be turned into fatal weaknesses through innovative thinking. His breakthrough came from studying something no military commander had ever seriously considered: farm wagons. Zika observed that Bohemian peasants used heavy, reinforced wagons to transport goods across rough terrain. These wagons were built to withstand harsh conditions and carry enormous loads. What if they could be weaponized? The result was the war wagon, perhaps the most revolutionary military innovation of the medieval period. Zika's war wagons weren't just armored vehicles. They were mobile fortresses that could be linked together to create instant fortifications anywhere on the battlefield. Each wagon was reinforced with iron plates and equipped with small cannons, crossbows, and firearms operated by crews protected behind wooden shields. But the true genius was in how these wagons could be deployed tactically. Traditional medieval armies needed to find or create defensive positions, hilltops, river crossings, or prepared fortifications. Zika's forces could create their own defensive positions instantly, anywhere they chose to fight. The psychological impact was devastating. Knights trained for centuries in cavalry charges suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that couldn't be charged. The war wagons formed circular or linear formations that were impenetrable to cavalry, while the defenders inside could rain down crossbow bolts and cannon fire with devastating accuracy. Zika's masterpiece came at the Battle of Sudomir in 1420. A massive crusading army, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, approached with over 25,000 men, including the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Zika had fewer than 9,000 troops, mostly untrained peasants, with improvised weapons. Traditional military doctrine said the battle was already over. Zika proved traditional military doctrine wrong. He positioned his war wagons in a defensive circle on a slight hill, creating what appeared to be a static defensive position. The Crusaders, confident in their numerical and technological superiority, ordered a massive cavalry charge designed to shatter the Hussite lines through sheer force. What happened next redefined medieval warfare. The heavy cavalry, thundering across the field in perfect formation, struck the wagon circle like a wave hitting a seawall. The wagons absorbed the impact while crossbowmen and early firearms cut down horses and riders with methodical precision. But Zika's true innovation was what happened after the initial charge failed. Instead of remaining in defensive positions, the war wagons began to move. Zika had trained his forces to fight from moving platforms, creating the world's first mobile artillery units. The wagons rolled forward in coordinated formations, maintaining their defensive capabilities while advancing to attack the not as organized Crusader forces. The psychological effect was overwhelming. Crusader knights, the elite warriors of medieval Europe, found themselves being systematically destroyed by peasants fighting from farm wagons. The entire social and military hierarchy that defined medieval warfare was being shattered before their eyes. Within hours, the crusading army was in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of casualties and most of their equipment. But Zika's innovations extended far beyond the war wagon. He pioneered combined arms tactics that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century. His forces integrated infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers in coordinated operations that maximized the effectiveness of each component. Zika also revolutionized military logistics and organization. He created the first truly professional peasant army in European history, with standardized training, equipment, and command structures. His forces were organized into units based on function rather than social class, a radical departure from medieval military tradition. Perhaps most importantly, Zika understood the power of ideology in warfare. His troops weren't just fighting for territory or plunder. They were fighting for a religious and social revolution. This ideological motivation made them willing to endure hardships and take risks that mercenary armies would never accept. The result was a military force that combined tactical innovation with unshakable morale. Over the next decade, Zika's forces defeated every major army sent against them. Crusade after crusade was launched against the Hussites, each larger and more determined than the last. All failed against Zika's revolutionary tactics. His war wagons became the terror of European battlefields, inspiring fear in knights who had never known defeat. The Battle of Enmik Broad in 1422 demonstrated the full evolution of Zika's tactical system. Facing a combined Imperial and Hungarian army of over 30,000 men, Zika deployed his war wagons in a complex formation that created multiple defensive lines while maintaining offensive capability. The battle became a masterclass in medieval combined arms warfare. War wagons provided mobile artillery support, while infantry and cavalry units maneuvered to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. The result was another crushing victory that established Hussite military supremacy in Central Europe. When Zika died in 1424, he had never lost a battle. His tactical innovations influenced military development for centuries, and many of his concepts weren't fully appreciated until the development of modern armored warfare. The war wagon was a direct ancestor of the tank, and Zika's combined arms tactics became the foundation for modern military doctrine. But perhaps his greatest achievement was proving that military innovation could overcome any advantage in numbers, equipment, or social status. He demonstrated that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the best armor or the finest horses. It was the one who could think differently about what warfare could become. Warrior 2! Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of God, who never tasted defeat. What happens when you combine the tactical brilliance of Alexander the Great with the strategic patience of a chess grandmaster and the psychological warfare mastery of Sun Tzu? You get Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Arab general who earned the title Saif Allah al-Maslal, the drawn sword of God, by achieving something no military commander in history has ever matched: fighting over 100 battles without losing a single one. Born around 592 CE into the Makhzum clan of Mecca, Khalid grew up in a world where warfare was both an art and a necessity. The Arabian Peninsula was a patchwork of warring tribes, each fighting for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But while other warriors focused on individual prowess and tribal honor, Khalid was studying something far more sophisticated: the mathematics of victory. His genius lay in understanding that every battle was a puzzle with a solution, and that solution could always be found through superior positioning, timing, and psychological manipulation. Khalid Su's revolutionary approach to warfare was built on 3 principles that would make him unstoppable: perfect intelligence gathering, flawless execution of complex maneuvers, and the ability to turn enemy strengths into fatal weaknesses. His breakthrough came during the Ridda Wars, when the newly formed Islamic State faced rebellions across the Arabian Peninsula. These were simple tribal skirmishes. They were coordinated uprisings that threatened to destroy the Islamic expansion before it could begin. Traditional military wisdom called for defensive strategies, holding key positions and waiting for the rebellions to exhaust themselves. Khalid saw opportunity where others saw crises. He realized that the rebels' greatest advantage, their knowledge of local terrain and tribal alliances, could be neutralized through a campaign of such speed and unpredictability that they would never have time to coordinate their defenses. His strategy was revolutionary. Instead of fighting each rebellion separately, he would create a mobile strike force that could appear anywhere on the peninsula within days, crushing resistance before it could organize. The result was the first blitzkrieg in military history, 1,300 years before the term was invented. Khalid's forces moved with supernatural speed across the desert, striking rebel strongholds with devastating precision and vanishing before counterattacks could be organized. His cavalry units covered distances that seemed impossible to contemporary observers, appearing hundreds of miles from where they were last reported. But the real innovation was in Khalid's intelligence network. He had agents embedded in every major tribe, providing real-time information about rebel movements, internal conflicts, and leadership dynamics. This intelligence allowed him to predict enemy actions with uncanny accuracy and position his forces for maximum impact. At the Battle of Ulay in 634 CE, Khalid faced his greatest challenge yet. The Sassanid Empire had assembled a massive army under Hormuz, one of their most experienced generals, to stop the Arab expansion into Iraq. The Sassanid force included heavy cavalry, armored infantry, and war elephants, the most advanced military technology of the era. Khalid had a smaller force of mostly light cavalry and infantry, with no siege equipment and limited supplies. Any conventional analysis would have predicted certain defeat. Khalid turned it into his most brilliant victory. His strategy was based on a psychological insight that would revolutionize medieval warfare. The strongest army becomes the weakest when it loses confidence in its own strength. Khalid spent weeks before the battle studying Sassanid tactics, identifying their psychological weaknesses, and developing a plan that would turn their military superiority into a fatal liability. The key was the war elephants. Sassanid commanders relied on these massive beasts to break enemy formations and create psychological terror. Khalid realized that if he could neutralize the elephants, the entire Sassanid battle plan would collapse. But instead of attacking the elephants directly, he attacked their handlers' confidence. Khalid's forces began the battle with a series of feigned retreats that drew the Sassanid cavalry away from their supporting infantry. Each retreat was carefully calculated to appear genuine, while actually positioning Arab forces for a devastating counter. The Sassanians, confident in their superiority, pursued aggressively, stretching their formations and separating their different units. When Khalid judged the moment was perfect, he executed what military historians consider one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in history. His forces suddenly stopped retreating and launched a coordinated attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Sassanid cavalry, expecting to continue their pursuit, instead found themselves surrounded and cut off from support. But the masterstroke was what happened to the war elephants. Khalid had positioned archers with specific instructions to target the elephant handlers, not the elephants themselves. As the handlers fell, the elephants became uncontrolled, turning on their own forces and creating chaos in the Sassanid ranks. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Sassanid soldiers, who had entered the battle confident of victory, watched their most powerful weapons turn against them. Morale collapsed as the disciplined Sassanid army disintegrated into a panicked mob. The battle became known as Yawm Alayh, the Day of Alayh, and the field was said to be so soaked with blood that it was called the River of Blood. But Khalid's greatest achievement wasn't any single battle. It was his conquest of Syria. In 636 CE, he faced the largest Byzantine army ever assembled, led by Emperor Heraclius himself. The Byzantine force included the best troops from across the empire: heavy cavalry from Constantinople, infantry from Anatolia, and allied Arab tribes who knew the local terrain. They outnumbered Khalid's forces by more than 2-1 and held strong defensive positions in the Yarmouk Valley. Khalid's response was to execute the most complex military maneuver in medieval history. Over 6 days, he systematically repositioned his entire army while maintaining the appearance of a static defensive formation. Using a combination of night movements, false camps, and coordinated deception, he managed to completely surround the Byzantine army without them realizing what was happening. The Battle of Yarmouk became a masterclass in tactical perfection. Khalid had studied Byzantine military doctrine for months, identifying every weakness in their command structure and battle tactics. He knew that Byzantine forces relied on rigid formations and centralized command, which made them vulnerable to attacks that disrupted their communication and coordination. His battle plan was designed to exploit these weaknesses systematically. The attack began with what appeared to be a frontal assault on the Byzantine center, but this was a feint designed to draw Byzantine reserves away from their flanks. As the Byzantines reinforced their center, Khalid's hidden forces struck their flanks and rear simultaneously. The Byzantine army found itself trapped in a perfect encirclement, with no escape routes and no way to coordinate a response. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical attack. Khalid had positioned his forces so that the Byzantines could see they were completely surrounded, creating a sense of hopelessness that shattered their will to fight. Within hours, the largest Byzantine army in history was completely destroyed. Emperor Heraclius himself barely escaped, and Byzantine control over Syria was ended forever. When Khalid died in 638 CE, he had conquered an area larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. His tactical innovations influenced military thinking for over a millennium, and many of his strategies are still studied in modern military academies. But perhaps his greatest achievement was proving that perfect execution of superior tactics could overcome any advantage in numbers, equipment, or position. He demonstrated that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the largest army or the most advanced weapons. It was the one who could think 3 moves ahead and execute those thoughts with flawless precision. Warrior 1, Belisarius, the last Roman who conquered an empire with 159. What happens when you give a brilliant general an impossible mission, a tiny army, and the weight of a dying empire on his shoulders? You get Belisarius, the Byzantine general who didn't just save the Roman Empire. He reconquered half the known world with forces so small that his enemies thought he was using magic. Born around 505 CE, Belisarius entered a world where the Western Roman Empire had already fallen. Barbarian kingdoms ruled former Roman territories, and the Eastern Empire was barely surviving constant invasions. Most generals of his era focused on defensive strategies, trying to hold what little territory remained. Belisarius looked at the same situation and saw the greatest military opportunity in history. His revolutionary insight was that the collapse of centralized authority had created a power vacuum that could be exploited by a force that combined Roman discipline with innovative tactics. While barbarian kingdoms had superior numbers, they lacked coordination, professional training, and strategic vision. Belisarius realized that a small, highly trained, mobile army could defeat much larger forces by striking where they were weakest and vanishing before they could respond. His genius lay in understanding that in the post-Roman world, quality had become infinitely more valuable than quantity.
Belisarius's breakthrough came during the Vandalic War of 533 to 534 CE.
The Vandal kingdom in North Africa controlled some of the richest territories of the former Western Empire, including the crucial grain supplies that fed Constantinople. Emperor Justinian ordered Belisarius to reconquer these lands with a force of just 15,000 men against a Vandal kingdom that could field over 80,000 warriors. Every military advisor in Constantinople declared the mission suicidal. Belisarius turned it into the most brilliant campaign in medieval military history. His strategy was based on a revolutionary understanding of logistics and psychological warfare. Instead of trying to match Vandal numbers, he would make numbers irrelevant through superior mobility, intelligence, and the systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The campaign began with what appeared to be a conventional amphibious landing near Carthage. But this was psychological theater designed to manipulate Vandal. Belisarius had studied Vandal military culture for months, identifying their psychological vulnerabilities and tactical limitations. He knew that Vandal King Gelimer was proud, impulsive, and prone to making emotional decisions under pressure. The landing was designed to trigger exactly the response Belisarius wanted. Gelimer, seeing what appeared to be a small Roman force, ordered an immediate attack to crush the invasion before it could establish itself. This was exactly what Belisarius had predicted and planned for. As the Vandal army rushed toward the landing site, Belisarius executed one of the most audacious tactical maneuvers in military history. His main force wasn't at the landing site at all. While Gelimer was focused on the obvious threat, Belisarius had secretly landed the bulk of his army at a different location and was already marching on Carthage itself. The psychological impact was devastating. Gelimer found himself fighting shadows while his capital was being captured by an enemy that seemed to be in 2 places at once. By the time he realized what was happening, Belisarius had already taken Carthage and positioned his forces to control the entire Vandal kingdom. But the true genius of the campaign was in how Belisarius turned the Vandal army's size against itself. The larger the force Gelimer assembled to fight him, the more difficult it became to supply and coordinate. Belisarius's small, mobile units could strike Vandal supply lines, capture key positions, and disappear before the main Vandal army could respond. Within months, the entire Vandal kingdom had collapsed, not through massive battles, but through the systematic destruction of their ability to function as a coherent military force. But Belisarius's masterpiece was the Gothic War in Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom controlled the Italian peninsula, including Rome itself, the symbolic heart of the empire. Reconquering Italy meant facing not just the Gothic army, but also the complex political situation of a peninsula divided between competing factions. Belisarius was given an even smaller force than in Africa, just 7,500 men to reconquer an entire kingdom. His response was to revolutionize the very concept of medieval warfare. Instead of thinking in terms of armies and battles, Belisarius thought in terms of systems and networks. He realized that the Gothic kingdom, despite its military strength, was politically fragile. Different Gothic nobles had competing interests. Italian populations were divided in their loyalties, and the kingdom's control depended on maintaining complex alliances that could be disrupted. Belisarius's strategy was to turn the Gothic kingdom's political complexity into a weapon against itself. His campaign began with the siege of Naples, but this wasn't a conventional siege. Belisarius had studied the city's defenses and identified a weakness that no one else had noticed: an ancient aqueduct that could be used to infiltrate the city. While the Gothic garrison prepared for a traditional siege, Belisarius's engineers were secretly working to access the aqueduct system. The attack, when it came, was so unexpected that the city fell within hours. But the real impact was psychological and political. The fall of Naples sent shockwaves through the Gothic kingdom, demonstrating that Belisarius could take supposedly impregnable positions through methods that seemed impossible. Gothic nobles began to question whether their fortifications could protect them, while Italian populations started to see Byzantine victory as inevitable. The siege of Rome in 537 to 538 CE became Belisarius's greatest triumph. Gothic King Vitiges assembled the largest army in Gothic history, over 150,000 men, to retake the Eternal City. Belisarius had fewer than 5,000 defenders inside Rome's walls. Any conventional analysis would have predicted certain defeat. Belisarius turned the siege into a masterclass in defensive warfare that redefined what was militarily possible. His strategy was based on a profound understanding of siege psychology and logistics. He realized that the Gothic army's enormous size was actually a weakness that could be exploited. Feeding and supplying 150,000 men required massive logistical operations that were vulnerable to disruption. More importantly, the longer the siege lasted, the more the Gothic army would suffer from disease, desertion, and internal conflicts. Belisarius's defense of Rome was unpassive. It was an active campaign designed to make the siege unsustainable for the attackers. His forces launched constant sorties that targeted Gothic supply lines, captured key positions outside the city, and created the impression that the defenders were stronger than they actually were. But the psychological warfare was even more sophisticated. Belisarius had agents spreading rumors throughout the Gothic camp about massive Byzantine reinforcements approaching, internal betrayals among Gothic nobles, and supernatural protection for Rome. The combination of military pressure and psychological manipulation gradually eroded Gothic morale and cohesion. After more than a year, Vitiges lifted the siege, not because Rome couldn't be taken, but because the cost of taking it had become prohibitive. The Gothic army that retreated was a shadow of the force that had begun the siege, weakened by casualties, disease, and the complete collapse of confidence in their leadership. Within 2 years, Belisarius had reconquered most of Italy with forces that never exceeded 25,000 men. His campaigns demonstrated that superior strategy and tactics could overcome any disadvantage in numbers or resources. But perhaps Belisarius's greatest achievement was proving that the Roman military tradition could be adapted and revitalized for a new era. His innovations in combined arms tactics, siege warfare, and psychological operations influenced military thinking for centuries. When Belisarius died in 565 CE, he had reconquered more territory than any general since Alexander the Great. His campaigns had restored Roman control over North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, nearly half the territory of the original Western Empire. But more importantly, he had demonstrated that military genius could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it appeared. He proved that in medieval warfare, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the largest army or the strongest fortifications. It was the one who could see possibilities where others saw only impossibilities, and turn those possibilities into reality through perfect execution of superior strategy. And there you have it. The 10 most brilliant tactical minds of the medieval period. From William Marshall's tournament innovations to Belisarius's impossible conquests. These warriors proved that in an age of swords and shields, the most powerful weapon was an innovative mind. What made these men truly extraordinary wasn't their physical strength or their noble bloodlines. It was their ability to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. They understood that every military disadvantage could be turned into an advantage through superior thinking. Each of these warriors faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through pure tactical genius. They rewrote the rules of medieval warfare and created strategies that are still studied in military academies today. But perhaps their greatest lesson is this: in any conflict, whether medieval or modern, the side that thinks differently has already won half the battle. These 10 warriors didn't just change military history. They proved that human ingenuity can overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it appears. Their legacy lives on in every military innovation, every tactical breakthrough, and every moment when someone refuses to accept that victory is impossible. The next time you face an impossible challenge, remember these medieval masters of mayhem? Sometimes the craziest strategy is the one that works. What did you think of these incredible warriors? Which strategy surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from history's greatest military minds. Until next time, keep thinking outside the box. You never know when you might need to conquer an empire with nothing but farm wagons and pure genius.